Hello, I'm Carlton Van Putten, founder and CEO of PayRent. Welcome to the Keys to Success podcast, where we unlock the secrets to smarter investments, smoother tenant management, and bigger profits, one episode at a time. Ready to master your property game? Let's dive in.
Welcome back to Keys to Success, the show to help you unlock those bigger profits from your rental properties. And today, well, we're kind of facing every landlord's least favorite topic: evictions. I know nobody wants to deal with this, but wouldn't you rather be prepared if you have to?
Absolutely. It's much better to have the knowledge and not need it than to need it and not have it.
Okay, that's a good point. So let's kind of set the stage here. We're going to use the parent guide to walk us through evictions. It breaks down the process into a few steps like notice, lawsuit, court hearing, and finally enforcement. So it seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, the steps themselves are pretty simple, but what can trip up landlords are the little details. One missed deadline or one wrong document, and you're back at square one. You're going to lose time and money.
Oh man, that's a hassle. So really it's all about dotting your I's and crossing your T's. Speaking of time, I think a lot of landlords think evictions are quick, like 2 weeks. But the parent guide says it could be anywhere from 14 days to even several months. Why is there so much variation?
Well, there are a few key factors. First, how cooperative is the tenant? Someone who understands the situation and leaves willingly will make it much faster. But if they're fighting you, ignoring notices, even damaging the property, that's going to drag things out.
So a bad tenant basically equals a bad timeline. What about the courts? Do they affect the timeline?
Yeah, for sure. A busy city court could have tons of cases, which slows everything down. Compare that to a rural area with a much shorter court docket. Then, of course, every state has its own specific laws about evictions, which adds another layer of complexity.
Gotcha. So location and local laws matter too. Okay, let's get to the part that I know nobody wants to talk about. Cost. Evicting someone isn't cheap, really.
Let's just say it's not something you want to budget for. The parent guide mentions an average of $3,500, but I can give you an example. I had a client in a similar situation, and it just blew up. The tenant fought the eviction, legal fees piled up, and then even having it enforced cost more for a locksmith and cleaning crew because of how they left the place. By the time it was over, they were out almost $8,000.
Wow, that is a lot of money. It sounds like it's not just about the court fees, which I'm guessing vary from place to place anyway. What other costs should landlords be aware of?
Yeah, you've got the court filing fees, then maybe attorney fees, especially if the case gets complicated. And you have to think about the cost of actually serving that eviction notice.
Yeah.
Usually that means hiring a process server. And sometimes you might need to get law enforcement involved to make sure the tenant leaves peacefully. And that's another expense.
Yeah, it seems like those costs can add up really quickly, especially if things get messy. It seems like it's really important to know about alternatives to eviction. The parent guide lists things like repayment plans, lease termination agreements, and even cash for keys. Can you explain how those work and when a landlord should think about using them?
Sure. Let's start with repayment plans. These are often a good option when you have a tenant who's normally good, but they've hit a rough patch. You know, they're willing to work with you and you eventually get the money you're owed. It's kind of a win-win if everyone is on the same page.
So it's a way to keep a good tenant and avoid the eviction process altogether. What about lease termination agreements? When would you use those?
Well, those are good when both you and the tenant agree it's just not working out. Maybe they need to relocate or there have been problems that just can't be fixed. If you both agree to end the lease early, it can save everyone a lot of stress and hassle.
So it's a more friendly way to end things, which is always better.
Yeah.
Okay, this cash for keys thing, that sounds a little strange. How does that work?
Think of it as an incentive. You're giving the tenant money to move out. It might sound weird, but sometimes it's cheaper and faster than a long eviction battle, especially if you think the tenant might cause problems.
That's interesting. So you're basically cutting your losses and maybe even avoiding bigger financial issues down the road. I could see how that would be a good option sometimes.
Right. And remember, any agreement you make, whether it's a repayment plan, a lease termination, or cash for keys, it should be in writing and legally sound. It's really helpful to have a lawyer who specializes in landlord-tenant law to help with that.
Yeah, that's good advice. Okay, let's talk about what happens after an eviction. even though I know it's something everyone would rather avoid. Because the work doesn't just stop once the tenant is gone, does it?
You're right. There are some important things that landlords need to do after an eviction to protect themselves legally and financially. Yeah, so even when you need to evict someone, it doesn't mean your problems are over. You've still got things to take care of.
Yeah, it's like cleaning up after a big storm. You got through the worst of it, but now you have to deal with the mess. What should landlords do first once the tenant is out?
Well, first, you've got to try to collect any unpaid rent. Just because the tenant's been evicted doesn't mean they'll pay up.
Right, that makes sense.
Okay.
But how do you actually get that money back? You can't just show up at their new place and ask for it, can you?
No, there's a legal process. If the court gave you a money judgment during the eviction, you can use that to try and get your money back. One way is something called garnishing wages.
Garnishing wages. That sounds intense. How does that work?
Let's say your old tenant now works at the grocery store. If you have that court order, you can legally force their employer to take some of their paycheck each month and send it to you until they've paid you back.
Wow, okay, so it's like taking the money right from their paycheck. But what if they don't have a job or try to hide their income? Are there other options?
You can also put a lien on any property they own, like a house or a car. That basically puts a hold on it so they can't sell it without paying you first.
It's like you're blocking them financially until they pay you back. It sounds complicated, though. Does it usually work?
It depends on their situation. Sometimes they just don't have any money, or they might try to hide their assets. But it's usually worth trying, especially if they owe you a lot. It's a good idea to talk to a lawyer who specializes in debt collection to help you with this process. They can guide you and make sure you have a good chance of getting at least some of your money back.
So it's about holding them accountable, but also being realistic about whether you'll actually get your money back. Let's move on to another thing landlords sometimes face after an eviction: abandoned property. What's the best way to handle that legally and ethically?
It's tempting to just throw everything out, but you have to be careful because it can lead to legal problems.
Okay, so what are the right steps to take?
Each state has its own laws about this, so you'll have to look those up. But usually you have to try to get in touch with the former tenant. That means sending them a written notice to their last address, letting them know about the stuff, and giving them a deadline to come and get it.
So you're basically giving them a chance to claim their things before you do anything with it. What if they don't respond or come and get their stuff by the deadline?
If they don't respond or don't come get their stuff, then you can get rid of it based on the laws of your state. Some states let you sell the stuff and use the money to cover what the tenant owes you. Others might require you to donate the items. The important thing is to keep records of everything. Keep a copy of any notice you sent, any conversation you had with the tenant, and how you got rid of the property. That way you'll have proof if they ever try to say you got rid of their stuff illegally.
It sounds like keeping good records is really important during this whole process, from the first eviction notice to dealing with abandoned property. It's like protecting yourself from future problems.
Got it. Okay, let's talk about the property itself. Once you've dealt with unpaid rent and the stuff left behind, it's time to get it ready for a new tenant.
Right, because you're not making any money while the property is sitting empty. What are the most important steps to get a property ready for a new tenant?
Well, first, you need to clean everything really well. That includes the carpets, appliances, bathrooms, everything. You want to make it look fresh and nice for potential renters.
Makes sense. A clean place always makes a good impression. What else should landlords do?
Next, you need to take care of any repairs or maintenance issues. This is where the move-in inspection report from the previous tenant comes in handy.
Oh yeah, the one where you go through the property and check for any problems before the tenant moves in.
Exactly. That report, along with any photos or videos you took, will help you figure out what damage, if any, the old tenant caused and what was just normal wear and tear. This is important if you need to use some of the tenant's security deposit to cover repairs, or if there's major damage that needs fixing before a new tenant can move in.
So you're not only fixing things, but also making sure you're not responsible for any damage the old tenant might have caused. Those reports are really important to protect landlords, aren't they?
Absolutely. They're one of the most important things you can do as a landlord. Once you've done the repairs, you might want to paint the place with some fresh, neutral colors. It can make the place look bigger and brighter, which will attract more potential renters.
So you're not just cleaning and fixing, you're making it look even better. What about staging? Should landlords do that too?
Staging can really make a property look more appealing, especially in a competitive market. It's about arranging furniture and decor in a way that makes people imagine themselves living there.
It's like setting up a model home for potential renters. We've been talking a lot about the practical stuff, but I think it's also important to talk about the emotional side of evictions. It's not just business, it can be personal too.
You're right, we tend to focus on the legal and financial aspects, but it's true that evictions can be emotionally draining for landlords. It can be frustrating, even feel like a betrayal when a tenant breaks their part of the agreement.
It's like a loss of trust, especially if you had a good relationship with the tenant before things went bad. What advice do you have for landlords who are struggling with how they feel after an eviction?
It's important to acknowledge your feelings. Don't bottle them up or pretend you don't feel anything. Let yourself feel frustrated, angry, whatever you're feeling. It's normal to have those feelings in a situation like this.
So you're saying it's okay to feel those things, not to judge yourself for it. What are some healthy ways to deal with those emotions?
Talking to a friend or colleague who understands what it's like to be a landlord can help. Sometimes just talking about it can make you feel better. You could also write down your thoughts and feelings in a journal.
So it's about finding a safe way to express yourself, whether it's with someone you trust or just by yourself. What else can landlords do to take care of themselves during this process?
Do things that help you relax and de-stress, like exercise, meditation, spending time outdoors, or doing things you enjoy. It's about taking care of yourself so you can handle the emotional stress. And if you're finding it really hard to cope, don't be afraid to talk to a therapist or counselor. They can provide support and help you through tough times.
It's good to remember that it's okay to ask for help when you need it. We've covered a lot today, from the steps involved in an eviction to the financial and emotional aspects. Now let's talk about proactive things landlords can do to reduce the chances of having to go through this whole process in the first place.
We'll talk about tenant screening and how choosing the right tenants from the start can help you avoid problems and give you peace of mind.
Okay, so we've talked about what to do when things go wrong, but what about preventing those problems in the first place? I mean, the best eviction is one you don't have to deal with, right?
Absolutely. And that's where tenant screening comes in. Choosing the right tenants from the start can save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Okay, so let's talk about tenant screening. Where should landlords even begin?
Well, I think the first thing is to figure out your must-haves. Like, what's your ideal tenant? What kind of credit score do they need? What about their income? Do you have rules about pets or smoking? If you have these things decided ahead of time, it's easier to stay objective when you're looking at applications.
So it's like having a checklist to make sure everyone meets the basic requirements. What comes after that?
Then you need to gather information. Usually you'll have potential tenants fill out an application. They'll give you details about their jobs, income, past rentals, and personal references.
So this is where you start to get a better picture of who they are. What are the most important things you look for when you're going through those applications?
One of the first things I check is their credit report. It shows you how they handle their money. You can see if they pay their bills on time, if they have a lot of debt, or if they've ever filed for bankruptcy.
So it tells you if they're likely to pay their rent on time and be responsible with money. Are there any red flags on a credit report that landlords should be aware of?
Definitely. Things like a history of late payments, accounts that have gone to collections, or a high debt-to-income ratio can be warning signs. It doesn't always mean they'll be a bad tenant, but it's definitely something to look into. You might want to ask them about those issues and see what they say.
So it's important to talk to them and get their side of the story.
Yeah.
What about verifying their employment? How important is that?
Oh, it's crucial. You need to know they have a stable job and make enough money to pay their rent. I always call their employer to confirm they work there, what their job title is, and how much they make. And it's also a good idea to ask for pay stubs or tax returns to back up the information they've given you.
So you're not just trusting them, you're double-checking everything. What about checking references from the previous landlords? How important are those?
References from past landlords are really helpful. They can give you an idea of what the applicant is like as a tenant. Ask things like if they paid rent on time, if they followed the rules of the lease, and if there were any problems during their tenancy.
So you're basically getting a preview of what it would be like to have them as a tenant. What kind of questions should you ask those previous landlords?
Don't be afraid to be specific. Ask things like, did they pay rent on time? Did they follow the lease agreement? Did they communicate well with you? Would you rent to them again? These questions will tell you a lot about whether they'll be a good tenant.
It's like getting a second opinion from someone who already knows them as a tenant. What about personal references? Are those worth checking, or are they just a formality?
Personal references can give you some information about their character, but you have to remember that these are people the applicant chose. They'll probably say good things about them.
So don't put too much weight on personal references.
Okay.
So once you've done all that, check their credit, verify their employment, talk to past landlords, how do you actually decide whether to approve them?
Well, now it's decision time. You have to go back to your must-haves list. Does this applicant meet your standards for credit score, income, job history, and so on? If they do, and you feel good about what you've learned, then you can offer them a lease.
What if they don't meet every single requirement? Do you automatically say no, or is there some flexibility?
You always have to use your best judgment and look at the whole situation. Maybe they have a slightly lower credit score than you want, but they have a good reason, like a medical emergency that hurt their finances. Or maybe they haven't been at their job for very long, but they have a good work history and great references from previous employers. You have to consider everything and make a decision based on all the information you have.
So you're not just blindly following a list, you're using your experience as a landlord. Before we finish up, I want to go back to something you mentioned before. Red flags. What are some signs that should make landlords think twice, even if an applicant looks good on paper?
One thing to watch out for is if they give you inconsistent or incomplete information on their application. If there are gaps in their work history or rental history that they can't explain, that's a red flag.
Yeah, like pieces are missing and you wonder why. What other red flags should we look out for?
Negative feedback from previous landlords is a big one. If a past landlord tells you that the applicant was always late with rent, damaged the property, or broke the rules, it's a sign that they might not be a reliable tenant.
So that's basically a warning that you might have the same problems with them. Anything else?
Always trust your gut. If something feels off or you think the applicant isn't being honest, trust your instincts and be careful. You can always ask for more information or documents if you're not sure about something.
It's important to listen to that inner voice, right? Well, this has been a great look at evictions and, even more importantly, how to prevent them in the first place. We've covered so much today, from the legal and financial side of things to the importance of carefully choosing your tenants.
And remember, choosing good tenants is the best way to protect your investment, reduce stress, and make your rental property a success.
It's all about setting yourself up for a smooth ride right from the beginning. Thanks for joining us on Keys to Success. We hope this information helps you navigate the world of rentals and reach your goals as a landlord. Until next time, happy renting.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Keys to Success. I invite you to check out past episodes and follow us on your favorite podcast platform to get notified when new ones are released. And when you're ready to simplify managing your properties, be sure to visit us at www.payrent.com.